Well, thanks again for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Through our UIC Alumni Exchange Series, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, and we'll go ahead and put this in chat, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program today as we are joined by alumnus Antonio Romanucci, who is one of the primary litigators for the family of George Floyd. He will share stories about advocating for clients' civil rights and creating reform as he discusses fighting police misconduct and advocating for social justice reform. Thank you, Mr. Romanucci, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over for you to begin the program.
And thank you very much, Karen, and welcome to all of our alumni. I'm very excited to be presenting to you today, and I hope that you find my discussion at least somewhat interesting. And the way it's kind of lead you through a little bit of what I do. You're going to hear about my background because many people right away, they'll either wonder, or if they have the courage to ask, they will say, why are you, a white man, being, what makes you so knowledgeable or be able to talk about social injustices and the marginalization of Black or brown or disenfranchised people? Well, I want to explain that to you because it's a very fair question off the bat, because and it does go from my experiences as a young man where I started working. And I hope to take you through that journey, give you an understanding a little bit about the Constitution, not too much, but just enough so you understand where this whole exercise is going to take us at the end, why it's so important to uphold our constitutional rights and not have them violated, no matter how small, because you will see that the continued erosion of constitutional rights, as I said, no matter how small, eventually leads to extreme distrust between members of the community and the police. And that's kind of the full circle that I hope to take you through once this is over. My primary objective here, as Karen said, is to talk to you about police misconduct. And yes, we do talk about police misconduct, but you should also know that as an alumni and as an individual living in the city of Chicago for nearly my entire life, I am pro-police. I'm not against police. I will call the police if I need them. But there is a small margin of police that statistics will show that very likely should not be policing. And as a result of this small percentage of police that are policing, they make up, it's like the old 80-20 rule. They make up, a very small percentage, between 3 and 5% of police officers make up over 80% of citizen complaints that are filed against the Chicago police, for example. And those numbers don't vary much across the country. So let me bring you back in time. I don't like to say this, but I consider myself old now. I reached the age of 60 last year. I'm going to be 61 this year. I graduated law school from UIC when I was 24 years old, so I was a little bit young. So I think I will be going into my 37th year of practice now, which is really hard to believe. I was very, very fortunate when I was 23 years old, when I was still in law school, that I got what's called a 7-11 internship with the Cook County Public Defender. And what makes a 7-11, that's under Supreme Court Rule 7-11, what makes it so interesting and engaging is that as a law student, you are allowed to practice law so long as you remain under the supervision of a licensed attorney. So when I did get assigned to the public defender's office, I either had one of two paths to go. I could go to the appellate division or the trial division. I was very lucky to go to the trial division. There is no question that that one fateful day in June of 2014, I'm sorry, 2000 and no, nine, I got to get my years straight here, folks. I'm so sorry. 1984. In June of 1984, that was when my career path was shaped, when I went to the trial division in the PD's office. So what does that mean? I used to work at a facility that is no longer in existence. Some of you might remember it. The Chicago Police Headquarters existed at 11th and State Street. They called it the Gray Lady. And it was a gray building, and the first 7 floors were Chicago Police Department headquarters. And then floors 8, 9, 10, and 11 were courtrooms. And the courtrooms back then were called, let me see if I could remember in the exact order. The 8th floor was women's court. The 9th floor was referred to as gun court. The 10th floor was auto theft court. And the 11th floor was retail theft court. They were all misdemeanor courtrooms, meaning there were no felonies that were charged there. But it was a very, very high volume courtrooms, 8 through 11. Literally hundreds of defendants would be processed through that courtroom every day. They would be processed in one of 2 ways. They either came in on bond hearings where they were arrested and they were being held overnight, and then there was a bond hearing to determine whether or not they would be released from custody or whether they would be sent to Cook County Jail. And then the ones that were released on bond, they had court dates to come back and hear their case, and they would either at that time plead guilty or have a trial or have their charges dismissed. So you have to understand, I was 23 years old back in 1984, and fresh-faced, coming from, at that time, I had lived in the suburbs with my parents for a while. I had graduated from UW, Wisconsin. So I already had a little bit of a liberal background from being at University of Wisconsin. I was very sympathetic. I did a lot of volunteer work at Wisconsin. So being in the PD's office immediately felt a little natural to me. What wasn't natural to me is how the detainees, the overnight prisoners, and people who came back for their hearings were treated. I did not have that understanding. I did not know that if you were a detainee in Cook County, that you were referred to as a dog. And multiple people were dogs. So you're either a dog or dogs. And when you consider that most of the detainees, and when I say most, I would say 60 to 70% of them were Black. Maybe 20% were Latino, 5 to 10% were white. You can see some pattern developing that the proportion, the majority of the people who were referred to as dogs were Black. And that is something that was very painful to me in listening to it, because I was not raised that way. My parents never, ever used any sort of racial slurs or profanity in the house, and I never did either. And to think that a human being was referred to as a dog, being a person that is an animal lover as I am, it was very disingenuous, very disrespectful. So I did whatever I could to treat these people the opposite of what the personnel in those buildings referred to them as. And my days usually started like this. I would walk into the courtroom early before court would start, anywhere from half an hour to an hour early. And the sheriff would open up the jail door, and there would be anywhere from, let's say, 10 to 30 overnight detainees. And I would walk in, and he would close the door and lock it behind me. And I would have to interview each and every person in that room in order to determine whether or not they were going to be eligible for bond. And so the worst thing you could do is show any fear whatsoever when you're locked in a cell with 30 overnight detainees. And what I learned, especially in the courtroom that I spent the most time in, was gun court. And there's a very, it's very significant to what we're going to talk about. The reason that gun court was such a good courtroom for me to learn in was because that's where I learned that Chicago police would develop a narrative for how to get guns off the street. Now, half of you who are listening to me, and maybe even all of you who are listening to me, are saying, Tony, get all the guns off the street. Well, you're kind of right about that. We don't have to talk about how serious the gun problem is in Chicago now. And it has been a problem ever since, the beginning of time when guns were allowed to be sold and exchanged. But there is a way, unfortunately, that there are rules. There are rules that we have to follow on how we get guns off the street. And those rules were set 250 years ago when our Constitution was established. And under the Fourth Amendment, we are all, none of us are subject to unreasonable search and seizure. And that is a very important, 5 or 6 words in our Constitution, because that means that we are subject to reasonable search and seizure. You are not allowed to be searched without consent, without your contraband being in plain view, or without a warrant. So the narrative that had been established in order to get guns off the street was the following. And this I learned over time, but I'm telling you in the space of the little bit of time that we have. The narrative back then was that when police would arrest somebody on a gun charge, the suspect was walking down the street with the butt of a gun sticking out of his waistband. And why is that important? Well, for those of you who have understood and what I just said, if your contraband is in plain view, that is an exception to the Fourth Amendment, and you are allowed to stop and detain that person and determine whether or not that contraband is real. If it's real, you're allowed to, the police are allowed to take it in their possession, and you're arrested for having a gun without an FOID card, having a gun in public view, whatever the charges may be. The other narrative that became very common involved motor vehicles. And that was that police officers would stop a motor vehicle, they would stop a car, and they would see that upon looking into the windshield, the butt of a gun sticking out from underneath the front seat of the car. Bingo. There's your plain view again. There's the exception to the Fourth Amendment. And before you know it, that individual and probably individuals in the car are all arrested. So that was the method in which police would get guns off the street. Now, we have to imagine that how many people walk around the streets of Chicago with the butt of a gun sticking out from outside of their waistband. I will tell you, in all the years that I've been in the city of Chicago, I've never seen it. I don't stop cars, so I don't know how many butts of guns stick out from underneath front seats, but I would imagine that the same is true. But what Chicago police were doing, they were conducting illegal stops. They were conducting what are called illegal Terry stops. So they would basically stop people. They would stop and frisk them. And if they did recover contraband, whether it was a gun or drugs, because I spent a lot of time in drug courtrooms also, branch 51 and 52 over at 26th Street. So I'm proud to say that, most of my career in the PD's office was about guns and drugs. So they would either recover guns or drugs, and that person was arrested. And what would happen is, because these people were marginalized, they're poor people, they're disenfranchised, they would wind up, because of the implicit bias that exists in not only in our policing, but our judiciary, and even in the public defender's office and the Cook County State's Attorney's office, most of these people wound up pleading guilty. The vast majority wound up pleading guilty. And you're thinking, well, what's so bad about that? Well, let me explain what's bad about it. A guilty plea causes you to lose your job, if you had one, causes you to lose your driver's license, causes you to lose the ability to earn an income. And then that slippery slope, that cycle that everyone hates of people being on, in state subsidies or federal government subsidies begins. And we all suffer. Taxpayers suffer as a result of these illegal stops that happen not by the tens or even dozens, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds per month, if not per year. And I can say that with extreme certainty because I'm actually involved in litigation against the city of Chicago now. It's been pending for years, but that's how things work. We generally call it the stop and frisk litigation. And that's because what we have found that over a period of years, Chicago police were stopping people unconstitutionally based on the Fourth Amendment. And what the numbers turned up was that 72% of the people that were stopped were saying unconstitutionally were Black, when only 28% of the population in Chicago was Black. But the majority, so you can see almost 250% more than their population were stopped on a pro rata basis for these unconstitutional stops. And the rest of them were either browns or brown people or white people or Asian. So we know that during that period that we're looking at between, I think it was 2009 and 2015, there were about 2 million of these stops that were made. 2 million. 400,000 to 500,000 per year in some years. So what does that do? See, that's another point here. That's another point that I've learned that I want to try to explain to you because, when we don't live on the streets, when we don't live in those neighborhoods, we can begin to understand that when you're stopped, when it's west side and south side, when the proportion of those stops are made in certain neighborhoods, you continue to erode trust between police and between the community. So when we hear about the Chicago police having a code of silence, well, we know that one also exists amongst the community because we know by listening to the news and reading the newspaper that even our communities don't like to rat on other people. There's this competing code of silence between policing and community because neither one trusts each other. And this trust emanates from these unconstitutional stops. It erodes the trust. And what it does for those Black people who are income earners and can afford it, eventually, even though they live in the neighborhoods, what we've now seen over the past, 2 census bureaus is that they'll leave. They leave the city of Chicago. So we're losing workforce, we lose tax base, we're losing population. Oh, did anyone say that we lost, a congressional seat in Illinois? So those are the kinds of things that happen as trust erodes between police and the community. And that's what I've learned over time. And that's why once I did leave the PD's office and I went into civil litigation, which is what I have been doing my entire life. And I've always represented people who can't afford lawyers. I'm what's called a contingency fee lawyer. I take on cases where people cannot afford lawyers. And if I'm successful for them, well, I get paid. A lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, I'd rather say that most of the time I am successful, but sometimes I'm not. And those are the risks that a contingency lawyer takes when they take on a case. But I'd like to think that as my career has advanced, that I don't take on cases anymore. I take on causes. And the reason that I take on causes is because Well, as you grow and as you mature, you get older, you have this incredible desire. It's almost like a fight between your body and mind that, if when your day comes that you want to leave this earth a better person, and you want to leave the earth having done better for the people that are still here, for my children, my family, my friends, and my colleagues. And so that's what I've been doing over the last, easily 10, 12 years. These past 10 or 12 years have been spent for me, finding causes as opposed to cases, because I really want to be able to say that we are a better country, we are better at what we do, and we need reforms. And so that kind of leads us a little bit into, what I've been busy with for the past 13 months. And when I say busy, that's an understatement, because, it's really incredible the number of hours that I've dedicated to the representation of the George Floyd family and his murder back on May 25th of 2020. And at this point, I can say that he was murdered because Derek Chauvin was convicted of George Floyd's murder. This is not something that we have to say that it's alleged or that it looks like he killed George Floyd. We can actually say that he murdered George Floyd because, a jury of 12 said so. They spoke. I was there for that trial. I've been in Minneapolis. I don't know how many days and nights. It's been a long time. As a matter of fact, when I leave here, I'm not in Chicago right now, but when I leave where I'm at, I get to go home for a day and then go back to Minneapolis, because Friday is a very important day for the George Floyd family and also for our country, because Derek Chauvin will be sentenced. And that is a very important day, because you have to understand the civil and criminal justice system, they intersect. Many people confuse me as being the lawyer who tried the George Floyd case back in March. And I keep correcting them that no, I'm the civil attorney. I'm the one who tries the civil case. I seek civil justice, not criminal justice. But folk on the street really don't distinguish a lot between civil and criminal. And here's why. And it's so important to understand why. Because people who are poor, disenfranchised, the marginalized, Black people, brown people, they see justice occur when there is a sentence handed out, when someone is also disciplined and punished for a wrongdoing the same way they have been punished and disciplined for wrongdoings that they have not committed. And this is a whole nother discussion. But when you talk about Chicago's history of corruption in the police department, and when you look at the John Burge era and all those people who were wrongfully convicted because they were tortured into confessions, you can see how this circle of trust continues to happen. And that's why what we're doing is so important, trying to rebuild this community trust. And that's why people who have been marginalized for all these years look to the criminal justice system to hand out sentence of equal value to that which they have been subjected to for all these years. And so the civil side crosses over with the criminal side, because as Ben Crump and I have found, that our clients, the Floyd family, they want justice out of the criminal system. And we were able to obtain justice on the civil side. We were able to get money for the Floyd family, because that's what I do. I don't hide from that. My job is to get the money to stop the bad conduct. And the criminal side is to convict people to stop the bad conduct. And so Derek Chauvin's sentence will be very meaningful right? I mean, we've heard that, he could be sentenced anywhere from 10 years to 40 years. And when you think about what Jason Van Dyke was sentenced to in the murder of Laquan McDonald, well, Jason Van Dyke was convicted of the same charge that Derek Chauvin was, and that was second-degree murder. The difference is this: George Floyd was murdered during a pandemic. Well, what does that matter? Well, here's what matters, is that most people were home. Most people were working from home, and they had their TVs on. And that's what made George Floyd into the case that it was. Also, the fact that he was pinned to the ground, now we know, not for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but actually it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And he was slowly choked to death by a police officer and colleagues who knew better, who failed to intervene and prevent and stop his death. Now, I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey on George Floyd, because I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of not only mental images, but also pictures that I've taken of myself to memorialize my own journey through George Floyd. So I'm going to take you through just a little portion of that right now. But, and I think we can start with the first slide. Shocking, right? So what emotions are you feeling? Are you feeling empathy, or are you feeling anger? Maybe you feel both. I do. I feel both, because certainly violence in the face of what we saw happen to George Floyd is not acceptable. The burning down of Minneapolis should not have happened. But people were upset. They were angry. George Floyd was the tipping point. George Floyd was the tipping point in this country where people said, enough is enough. And what sort of people? All people. All sorts of people said it. Doesn't matter what color you were, what ethnicity you were, how wealthy you were, how poor you were. Many people said this should not have happened. And so we were called in to, Ben and I were called in by the family within 36 hours of this happening. So we were on this almost immediately, and we were preparing, which is a whole nother discussion. I'm not going to tell you what we were preparing for, but we were preparing for everything. If I could have the next slide. This is my first trip into Minneapolis, and the hollowness of the Minneapolis airport. If you've ever been there, the terminals are extremely long. It's a long walk from one end to the other, almost longer than O'Hare for some reason. But that's it. That's what Minneapolis was like on the Tuesday after May 25th. I'm not sure what day that was, June, maybe 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, somewhere around that time. If I could have the next slide. So this is actually the corner of 38th in Chicago. That's the infamous Speedway gas station that's across the street from Cup Foods. And you can see Cup Foods in the background on the right side of your screen. And underneath that area is where George was killed. Now, this area of 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis is deemed not to be the safest place in Minneapolis. It's supposed to be very dangerous. And in fact, just very recently, there were shootings during the middle of the day when reporters were out there reporting on the day of the verdict of the criminal case. And we were advised that it was not safe to go there. But if you know me, you know that I have stood in front of rallies. I have spoken at rallies. and I will not back down, and I will not be afraid. As a matter of fact, I will embrace the situation, because if there is any trust to be gained, then you have to be in the middle of the fight. If I could have the next slide, please. And here you can see that is the actual, if you want to call it, the kill zone where George died, where Derek Chauvin's knee pressed on his neck in a prone position while George was handcuffed with his hands behind his back, and 3 other officers pressing their weight on his back. So that as George died, he died really probably over a period of maybe 4 to 5 minutes. Had he been a lesser in shape man, he was very athletic, he probably would have died in half that time. But he was able to survive for those 4 or 5 minutes because he was in such great shape. He was in amazing shape, incredible. And that's why he was able to survive for as long as he did. But Derek Chauvin was pressing on his neck with his knee, cutting off the blood circulation to his brain, while officers officers Lane and Kong were kneeling on his back, and Officer Tao was ensuring that the people who were surrounding him wouldn't get close to him. So George had about 500 pounds of human weight on top of him that was squeezing the life out of him. No blood going to his brain, and the compression on his lungs, he couldn't take any air in. So now you can see why, we characterized what happened to George as torture, because it was. And I have the medical doctors who said it was torture. This is the area that surrounds where George was killed. And to this day, because I've been back to 38th in Chicago at least half a dozen times, the memorials are still there. And what's really has been amazing and beautiful, what's come out of the memorials is the art that people have, how they've expressed themselves in the art of George Floyd, and how they feel about, as you can see, injustice and I can't breathe and say his name, or being Black in America, Black Lives Matter. The art that's come out of George Floyd really is an expression in and all of itself. Next slide, please. You're looking at this and saying, why is this important? This was our first press conference after George Floyd was murdered. So this was the first time that George Floyd got to speak from the grave through his attorney, Ben Crump, myself, and the 2 individuals standing next to us there are Dr. Monique Wilson and Dr. Michael Bodden. They are both medical examiners. And we had 2 independent medical examinations of George Floyd, because we wanted to be sure what we were saying. Those 2 doctors did not know each other before the medical examinations. So it's not like they teamed up and coordinated and collaborated on what they were going to say. But we had 2 different opinions, and the opinions came out the same, that George Floyd did die of homicide as a result of asphyxiation, which means, he was basically choked to death. And this was the day that we also began our messaging. And this is the day that when we messaged that it was the city of Minneapolis that really had their knee on the neck of George Floyd, and not Derek Chauvin. Because the city of Minneapolis, as great of a city as it is, has a history of racism in its police department. And that's something that we were going to aim to stop. We wanted that to stop. There was going to be no more racism in Minneapolis when it came to policing. And we were very lucky to have partners. The mayor, Mayor Fry, became our partner in this. The state's attorney, Jim Rauter, became our partner in this. The governor became our partner in this. Everybody said enough. And I will tell you what Minneapolis has done in their reforms since George Floyd. They need to be commended. We are grateful to them because they are the most reformed police department that I have seen in this country, and it will lead to saving lives. Make no mistake, good policing will lead to saving lives and rebuilding trust. So that was the day that we started messaging that it wasn't Derek Chauvin, but it was the entire city. And that's when the movement began of real police reform. Next slide, please. Well, this is Joe Biden and his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, who came to visit the Floyd family when the following week that you saw us there, when we were in Houston for the funeral of George Floyd. This was the first time that Joe Biden, most people think it's comical, but he did it. He did it the way he thought was right. First time he left his basement, so to speak, he came out to express his condolences to the Floyd family, and that's who's sitting around the table. And you might recognize Al Sharpton sitting next to Joe Biden. Next slide, please. And then it became what we needed to do, what Ben and I realized is that we could not stop the message. If we really were going to represent a cause, we knew that we could not stop with the messaging of what we needed, and that was reform. We required reform to come out of the death of George Floyd. We knew what we had to do for the Floyd family. We know what our job is. We know how to do our job. We know how to do it well. But what we don't know how to do well is fight for that cause. And we did. And that was the constant messaging that you'll see now in the next slide. So this isn't messaging, but this is important. This is a very important slide because it really galls me, and it just happened to me the other day, and it constantly happens. When people hear that I represent George Floyd, or if they know that I represented the George Floyd family, and boy, I'm going to hold my words. I cannot tell you how upset I get when I hear the first words come out of people's mouths, say, "Oh, but he was a drug addict." So what? Even if George was a drug addict, is that what we do to people in our society? We murder them? So this is part of his family. This is just a small part of his family at the funeral, wearing white in solidarity for George Floyd, because these people represent the spark of life that George Floyd was. George was a human being. Our society dictates that we do not kill other people. We do not murder, even if they have mental health issues, even if they have physical addictions. We help those people. We don't kill them. Next slide, please. And this is George's funeral. An amazing, and I hate to call it a spectacle because that's not what it was, but what a show of solidarity and respect for someone who his daughter Gianna at 8 years old said, "My daddy is going to change the world." And yep, Gianna, you're right. Your daddy did change the world, and let's hope he continues to do so, that we learn from his death. Next slide. This is just part of the throng. I can't sit here and tell you that I wasn't overwhelmed by all the media that was surrounding this case, because it was beyond magnanimous. It was beyond anything I've ever seen. I've been interviewed before, many times, but this was beyond anything I've ever seen. This was a parking lot filled with tents, dozens and dozens of tents of media from all over the world. And there you can see Lester Holt from NBC reporting live from the funeral, walking out of the van, and people just wanting to hear what does the family think? What do they know? I can tell you what the family thinks. It's been a year, and I still think they haven't had quality time to grieve over George, because they've been so consumed with justice. They've been so consumed with helping other families who have been aggrieved as a result of unlawful police shootings that I don't think, and I tell them constantly, they have not had enough time to grieve. Next slide, please. So here's, continued messaging of what we're doing. This is the day that the lawsuit was filed. Not the greatest picture because you can't see all the media that was there, but we had to be very careful of, in July of 2020 that we were socially distanced and, masks. And so we were in pandemic situations. So we had to be very careful of what we were doing. But every single time we had the opportunity, we were always messaging about accountability, about transparency, about that a Black life is worth the same as that of a white life. Think of the disingenuity of valuing the two lives any differently. Next slide, please. I was there. This is me. This is my iPhone taking these pictures. This is in September, right after Labor Day of 2020. This was the March on Washington, and I'm right in the middle of it. And by the way, I never got sick. I never contracted COVID, and I'm double vaccinated now, so I feel very fortunate. But I was always careful. But I was in the middle of that crowd, and I spoke that day to this crowd about racial equality, about Black Lives Matter. And you can see the gentleman on the right that it's everybody versus racism. And that's something that we need to stop in this country, because by stopping racism, we make all of ourselves better. You look at the city of Chicago. If we segregate ourselves, desegregate ourselves better, I should say, we become a better society. If we integrate, we become better. If we distribute funds that typically only go into the 5 downtown neighborhoods, into the other neighborhoods, and we create jobs and we equalize income, we're going to be a better society. We're going to reduce crime. We're going to reduce Black flight. We're going to be a better city. And Chicago is what, down to 2.6 some odd million people. And it was 3.4, 3.5 million 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We got a problem, people. Our tax base keeps leaving. Next slide, please. This is the start of the criminal trial. And once again, it's just all about messaging. It's just about the constant drumbeat of messaging. And I'll tell you, it worked, because when Ben and I would go around and people would stop us, they'd be repeating our words. They'd be repeating the narrative of accountability, of transparency. Next slide, please. So I just want you to look at that slide with the next slide. So that's 38th in Chicago. It's likely to become, at least a portion of it, a permanent memorial, for George Floyd. And it likely should, because so many people travel to it. The only problem is that, these businesses are affected. There's nobody there that really solicits and goes into these businesses anymore, because traffic is shut down. And so the Floyd family and the lawyers associated with the Floyd family are committed to the George Floyd Community Trust, which we established, and it's seated with $500,000 right now. And we're going to be helping those businesses along 38th in Chicago, because we don't want them to survive, but we want them to thrive. And that's part of the initiative that we have made it a part of our cause, in order to make sure that they also survive. Next slide, please. I told you about some of the art and some of the things that I see, and this is a little prophetic, because that's a waste can with, the RIP, with the rest in peace. And, when you think about really what a waste all of this was, because had one of those police officers in all the time that they had while Derek Chauvin was kneeling on his neck said, "Hey man, get off him, you're killing him," had they done their job, right? A 5-year-old knows that you're not supposed to choke someone. Well, a trained police officer should also know that. 4 trained police officers combined had over 2,500 seconds, right? Literally thousands of seconds to make split-second decisions to stop killing somebody, but they let it happen. And then when you go back to the first slide of Minnesota burning, that's why Minnesota and so many other cities also were subjected to the violence and then the unlawful looting that happened, just because enough was enough and opportunities were given that shouldn't have been there. Next slide, please. And this is more of the art. This was a huge mural that somebody created that Ben and I were standing in front of. Again, bigger than life, larger than life. That's because that's what this case became. It became a larger than life case, the civil rights case of the century. And that's why the moment cannot go wasted. We need reforms in Washington. We need reforms in our states. Illinois was one of those states that passed reforms. So we're very fortunate that our state government saw that we needed reform, and they did. Next slide, please. Those are the famous words, and I'm showing you this not to disturb you, but because that's the image that you have to remember when somebody says they can't breathe. I haven't spoken yet to Derek Chauvin. I probably never will, because our civil case settled. But if there was one question that I couldn't wait to ask him in his deposition, if I ever got to his deposition, was, Mr. Chauvin, when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," did you believe him? And think about his answers. He either says no, and we know what the end result was, or he says yes, but he decided to continue to kneel on his neck anyway. And so that's the incongruity of what happened to George Floyd during a pandemic, when everybody's watching TV, when that brave young girl, Darnella, she videotaped, she filmed the whole encounter for the world to see. Next slide. How much time do we have? Oh, I think we're in Q and can I have our moderator back just for a second? Are we?
You're okay. Do you? We've got about 9 minutes or so, but I don't want you to lose your train of thought. So if they're
no, do you want to go into Q&A, or do you want me to just go through this quickly, and then we, yeah. I can stay an extra 5 or 10 minutes if you want to do Q&A. It's up to you. I don't know how strict you are on time.
If we usually start to lose people just at the hour because of, I think, other commitments.
Sure.
But if maybe 5 more minutes, and then we can jump in with some questions. I'll just see.
Absolutely. We'll do this quickly.
Great. Thank you so much.
You can see the model police reform, and that's something that Ben and I decided, again, we needed to do. If we're gonna take on this cause, then we have to be serious with what we're going to do. And so we wrote a white paper as to what reforms should happen, not only state by state, but in our country, in order for there to be better policing. And we've been on the road. It's been a road show for us. And some states have taken this very seriously. Colorado is taking it seriously. Illinois is taking it seriously. California is under consideration. And there are a lot of states who are going to undertake police reforms. And I'm not saying just because of us, heck no. But We're there to encourage them to do it. And people need to know. So next slide. And the reason is because you can see unarmed black men are 3.5 more times likely to be shot by police than unarmed whites. Since George Floyd was killed, I lose track of the number. I think there are about 105 black men that have been shot by police since George Floyd. And some of them, I don't even have to go through the names because you hear about them and you read about them. But it's a problem. It's a problem. 3.5 times more likely black man being shot than white man, when the population shows that whites outnumber, white men outnumber black men probably by 3 or 4 to 1. Next slide. So right now, within the next week, Congress is poised to act. The House already passed the George Floyd Police Reform Bill. It's pending right now. The Senate is waiting to act. And I can't tell you, folks, whether the Senate's going to pass it or not. I am very involved in the process. I've been out to DC several times to lobby. I've even been involved in some of the drafting of the language within the bill. And I can't tell you what's going to happen because it's so political. It's so political as opposed to just being pragmatic and realistic. I don't know what'll happen. Let's just hope, wait, and pray that there's a compromise that is reached that is acceptable to everybody, to both sides, and that we get the 60 votes to pass it. Next slide. I'm going to have to go through these quickly or else we're going to leave no time for Q&A. The one thing that is probably the most important element in great policing is officer training. If you train officers from the beginning, you will have good police officers. Why don't we have good training? Because training is expensive. Training is very expensive. But the human cost and even the hard costs would come back in shovelfuls if we were able to spend the money on training. The city of Chicago has spent $600 million in police misconduct settlements and lawyer fees in the past 10 to 12 years. We could have spent that money, probably 1/4 of that money on training, and you still would have come out way on top, saving hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you take care of police officers and their mental health also, you're going to make better police officers. We've seen a terrible, terrible scourge of officer suicides over the last 24 months. And that's because they don't have good mental health training themselves. Next slide. Okay, too many words. We don't have enough time. Next slide. And we've talked a lot about this. In order to lead to trust, we need to change the culture. The culture of the police department has to change from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. If police officers really can be given the opportunity to protect and serve and be guardians of the community as opposed to being warriors, like the militarization of the police, I think that will lead to a much greater trust. And transparency, well, that's another word for let's get rid of this code of silence. Let's get rid of this brotherhood that exists, that it's us versus them. If we're transparent in what we say, then people will believe us more. Next slide. Same thing. We need body-worn cameras. BWCs help us a lot in determining whether or not events as stated in narratives actually occurred. And that helps the police, it helps the community, because a lot of times police officers are telling the truth, and we need to believe them when it is their turn. Next slide. Oh, I could spend an hour just on this alone. Mental health of citizens, also known as emotionally disturbed people, EDPs, a disproportionate amount. I think the last statistic I heard was about 38% of people that are shot by police have mental health issues. Those are people that need medical help. they don't need policing, but because they act in a very bizarre way, sometimes they don't act consistently, they don't listen to commands because they can't, they get shot and they die. Next slide. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. What we're trying to do here is preserve life and not take life. That's what police officers should be doing, and that's why de-escalation is so important. If George Floyd was de-escalated properly, once he was on the ground in a prone position, handcuffed behind his back, he'd be alive. I wouldn't be talking to you today, probably. Next slide. Too much time. Can't talk about qualified immunity. We need a whole lecture there. Accountability. Well, we all, I think we all get our hair cut. We all go to some barber or some beauty salon to get our hair cut, and they all have a license hanging next to them saying that they are licensed to cut hair. Well, police officers aren't licensed. We need them licensed so we can ensure accountability, so we can have a national database so that police officers aren't moved around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction when they're fired from their job. They shouldn't be able to police once they get fired because of events that either harm or take human life. Next slide. Here we go. Hopefully we have time for Q&A.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And really thank you for taking us through this journey and through your experience. We really run these programs to generate thoughts and ideas, and I'm very grateful to you for sharing all of that with us. We've had a few questions come in, and one is a question and a statement. And the statement was, the person says they're struggling to see actual reform because police are still killing Black people. And then where is the reform? And I would like to take the liberty to add on to that. What can the average person do to help support this reform?
Well, you are right. It's hard to see the reform yet. And look, I have said, and you may not like this answer, but I have said that true reforms is a generational thing. My estimate of how long it will take to see real reform in this country in policing is between 1 to 2 generations. We need literally 1 to 2 generational turn in order for policing to come back, because it does revolve, I feel very strongly, around trust. And right now you have a segment of the community that does not trust. But if we start teaching our children young about the importance of the trust between policing and the communities, about transparency, and teaching them that racism is something that should never exist, that's when things will change. It's hard, and I'm with you. It's really hard to believe that there's changes coming, but they're happening slowly. When I do know that states across the country are instituting reforms, it's going to take a while for those reforms to come into effect. Because, even after George Floyd was killed, we saw so many people being shot unnecessarily. Stop, because police, I'm sorry, you have to say it, they are afraid of Black people. People have this innate fear of Black person, and police do. And we see that Black people are not treated the same as a white person would in the same situation. So we have to have that generational turn both in the community and in the police in order to get rid of those biases. It takes time, and it's got to start now. That's why we can't lose the moment.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, if you can hold on with me for just a few minutes.
Sure.
So you touched a little bit upon this, but we had received a pre-question, which was, how is George Floyd's family doing 1 year after his murder? And how is the verdict affected, with all the media attention, and just how are they doing?
So the George Floyd family is probably doing as well as they can. They're a very tight-knit family. They are very close. Alumnus Floyd has become the face of the Floyd family. That's George's first youngest brother. And then there's his brother Rodney, who's always with him, and then the nephew Brandon. The 3 of them really have become the face of the Floyd family. And I did say, and I mean it, I don't think they've yet really appropriately grieved. They do cry, and so have I with them. But it's not the cry that I would expect as to what happened, because they've been going around the country, and I've gone with them, visiting other families whose loved ones have been taken by police officers, what we think unlawfully, where there's a cry for racial justice. So they've been working very, very hard. And I do have a feeling that after Friday, when the sentence comes down, I think that's when we're finally going to see that vacuum hit them. And I think that's when they're finally going to have their moment.
Thank you. And then finally, considering all that you've seen over the course of your career, do you think that we've reached an inflection point for police misconduct?
Look, I don't want to go through this again. I don't want to be, this country, I shouldn't say me, this country should not have to go through this again, period. So if we haven't reached an inflection point, shame on us. Shame on us and damn us if we don't take this moment and make it work. Because I'm afraid, I'm really, really afraid if there's another June of last year in the city of Chicago. Let's just use Chicago. What's going to happen to our businesses, to our communities? We'll have more people move out. How many? I am so disgusted, and I shouldn't say disgusted. I'm so hurt by how many people I know are moving out of the city, moving out of our state, because they just want a different life. It's too many people. So if this isn't our inflection point, we're in trouble. So that's why I'm putting my foot down, trying to make sure that this is the inflection point. And if you have the time, you have the desire, even though you're one phone call, but if we all make that phone call to DC, and you talk to Senator Durbin and Duckworth and tell them how important this reform bill is, just let them know they're for it. They are for it. They're not against it. But you calling them helps, because Dick Durbin is at the center of the negotiations on this bill.
Thank you. Thank you for that action item. I think that's a really important thing for people to walk away with. And thank you so much for sharing all these stories and this journey with us. We're very, very grateful and very proud that you are a graduate, and grateful for your time and knowledge today. Just to close this out, please join us tomorrow for our next Alumni Exchange program, which will be very different. On Thursday, June 24th at noon Central Standard Time, as we'll be joined by UIC Associate Professor and Geriatric Researcher, Dr. Valerie Gross. Taking care of our eldest generation can be extremely challenging, and Dr. Gross will share innovative approaches, how she uses technology to our advantage as she presents the future of aging, how technology enhances older adult care across the globe. Mr. Romanucci, thank you again. We are very grateful again for you and for your time today. To find a recording of this episode and any of our past episodes, please go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that brief survey I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future Alumni Exchange program. Thank you again, Mr. Romanucci, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.